We're going to be exploring the difference between function expressions, function declarations, creating some page counters that are going to run within functions, and they're going to be accessing variables that are only going to live within the function. So these aren't going to be global values, but they're going to be values that are going to access within the function. And we're going to see the difference between how they work and how we can select different instances of those values. So each one of these counters is going to be running a separate instance of the function. And we've got 3 separate functions, but we can also, if we assign it to the same function, it's still going to run a separate instance to it. So as we click the different buttons, those values will change, and they're going to reference different total values that are being output on the page. And that's going to be whatever the value is that's being contained within the function. Let's create an HTML file and then link it to the JavaScript. So in this case, I've created a file called app1.js. We've got a couple elements on the page, so that's an output area, and then a button that we can click and have an action within the JavaScript code. So let's go ahead and select our JavaScript code. I've also got the HTML file opened on the right-hand side within the browser window. I'm going to open up the DevTools and link the DevTools. So add the DevTools to the bottom of the page. Opening up the developer tools, I am using Chrome. So move that to the bottom so that we can see it all within the one screen. And then we'll just have the console area. So what we want to do is we want to create an action whenever the button is clicked and run a function that's going to update the counter value. So let's do that where we're going to set up a value for the counter. And we'll select the page elements. So selecting the button using the document and query selector. Select the element with a tag of button. And then also select the output area. So using the document and then query selector and select the element with a class of output. So we'll select both of those and then add an event to the button. So just call it onClick. And we'll run a function called adder. So that's going to invoke the function adder. And then here we'll create the function. So call it adder. And we'll start out by having a check to see if the content of the adder is going to be 0, and if it is, then we're going to increment it. So we're not going to be using a global value. We could use a global variable that we could increment, but we want to have it self-contained within the function, so we want it all to live within the function. So within the function itself, we're going to create a variable for total. So the variable for total is going to be living within the function, and in order to reference whatever the current variable is within the function, then we're going to be referencing it within the adder. And using this allows us to check first to see if the total is undefined. And so if it's not available, if it doesn't exist, then we want to create a value of total. So we'll select and set up a value for this total and assign a value of 1 to it. And if it does exist, then we're going to take the value of this total and we're going to increment it by 1. And then take the value of output and update the text content to whatever we have for this total. I use the temperate literals and I'll output total, and then we can have the value of the current this total being output on the page whenever the button is clicked. So that's going to be incrementing that value, and as long as we're using this, it's going to be referencing whatever the current value there is on the page. So also, whenever we're using, I'm going to add in a second button on the page, and this is going to select an element, and I'll give it some classes. So let's do an update. So call it button 1 and button 2, and then we'll assign some classes so that we can distinguish between the 2 buttons on the page. And I'll update this to be button 1, go out to the page, and we're going to update and add in the classes and then also add in the buttons. So update this and set this class to be btn1 so that we can select it. And we're going to use the arrow format for the second button. So whenever the second button gets clicked, we'll run adder2. So we'll run adder1 on the first button, and then adder2 on the second button. So let's create the function for adder2, and we'll create it as a variable, and assign it to a function. And then within this function, this is where we're going to have the same code. So we're going to be selecting whatever the current element is and then updating the total on it. So we've got the two buttons. They're both referencing different totals. So that's the interesting thing about doing it this way, is because we've got two separate functions and they're referencing two separate totals. So depending on the button and depending on which button I'm clicking, it's going to update that value to be the second total. So total, and I'll update this to be total 2 and this to be total 1 so that we can see the difference as we're clicking it. So total 1 is at 1, 2, 3, 4. And then when we press the second button, it's got a totally separate counter. And that's going to be a self-contained counter within this function. Let's also add in a third button. So create a third button. And we'll link this counter. So selecting it as a button. Linking it to the other button counter. So do you think that if we are linking it to the counter 1 and we're pressing button 3, it's going to be updating counter 1, or it's going to create an entirely separate instance of that counter? So right now counter 3 or total 1 is at 14, this one is at 8, and then adder 2 is just starting out. So even though it's running into the same function, the instance of the function is going to be different, and the object that is containing the function is going to be separate as well. So there's also another format that we can do, and that's going to be the arrow format. So that's the newer format where you do the arrow function, and you can run calculation, and this one will set to be adder 3. So we'll see what happens when we do the adder 3. So the adder 3 now is running another totally separate function on its own, running all of the totals completely separate from what we've got contained within the main adder function. So those are 3 different ways that you can create the click events. And if we were to move these before, we're going to throw an error. So we're using the function declaration or the function statement. This actually doesn't matter when we're placing it in, because this doesn't require us to assign a variable for it. And these actually get executed before any other blocks of code. But when we're using the function expressions, as we are in adder 2 and 3, we need to define the function before we try to use it, as the function expressions are going to be accessed whenever the program reaches that code in order to execute it. So both of these are function expressions, whereas this is a function declaration, and you can place that anywhere in the code. So as you can see, they're going to run the same way, and you also have the choice to use the arrow format, or you can use the named function format, as these are anonymous functions that are being tied to these variables. And that's how we're referencing them and invoking those functions. So go ahead and try it out. Add some counters, and then create different ways to run those self-contained functions that are going to hold the values for the variables as the buttons get clicked. And you can be ready to move on to the next lesson.